recording. Um, there it goes. If you do not wish to be part of the recording, let us know, and or don't say anything is probably the easiest thing. Um, the first thing I want to do, which I think is quite important, is this wonderful new book is available. Whoa, that's the wrong link. Hang on. Is available, it's open access. You can just download the PDF to your heart's content. So I'm going to start off by just putting the link for that directly into the chat. So all of you, if you haven't already, download the book and, I don't know, read along. Um, so I'll give you a quick sketch of the schedule. Then I'll send you over to the volume's editor, Chris Manias. So if we're going to start with Chris, who will talk for about 5 to 10 minutes and introduce us to the book. We'll then have 5 responders, Riley Black, Natalia Jagielska, Alison Lawrence, and Mike Benton. They will have sort of short kind of interventions. There'll then be a period of time for approximately 20 minutes where there will be a discussion between the respondees and any of the authors in the room who feel like jumping in. I might use chair's prerogative at that point if I get sufficiently excited. And then after that point, we'll have a kind of open discussion for around about half an hour. So that's the sort of basic schedule. I'll probably give a bit more information when we get to the more open discussion, but I don't see any point in me just saying a bunch of stuff. I think instead we should pass over to Chris and get him to describe this book. Take it away, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So I'm Chris Manias. I'm a historian of science based at King's College London. I'm the editor of this book, but I'm also the organizer of the Popularising Paleontology group, which is where the book has grown out of. So I'm more going to be talking about the background to the book, where it's come from and what we've been trying to do with it and the sort of origin of it. So as I mentioned, I'm a historian of science, and I became directed towards being a historian of paleontology maybe about 15 years ago, when I started on work that would very eventually become my last kind of single authored book, which is this one, The Age of Mammals, that came out about 2 years ago, which is a big book on the history of mammal paleontology across the world in the 19th century. But while starting doing the work on this, I quickly found it was quite important to really both root myself in the historical aspects around the topic, but also really to try to get to grips with the more technical scientific material around the quite bewildering terminology that you kind of encounter when you first sort of look at paleontology in a sort of serious way, which kind of led me to look at how paleontology was being dealt with within the modern sciences and kind of modern culture more generally. And this was a bit kind of surprising for me because I kind of trained as a historian of science. And one of the things about historians of science that people outside the field often don't get is that we're often trained to be quite skeptical and wary of engaging with modern scientific practitioners. Partly this is about maintaining the status of critical outsiders, which is something the historians of science like to do, but it's also partly based on an assumption that workers in the sciences don't really reflect on the cultural and political assumptions around their fields and around scientific work. And so they would be, fundamentally different in terms of their perspective from, that of historians of science, who really, their kind of fundamental assumption is that science is fundamentally embedded within politics and culture. But I found that when I was going through the work around paleontology, that this very often wasn't the case, and that many paleontologists and, science communicators with paleontological interests were very kind of concerned, very interested in, the cultural and often the political role of their fields. So, how it's become, one of the most prominent scientific fields in public culture, why things like dinosaurs, mammoths, Neanderthals, and so on are part of everyday mental furniture across the world. And this is despite paleontology's often quite marginal status within universities and kind of more established and sort of larger scale scientific communities. And I also found that lots of paleontologists were really interested in how pop culture, economics, and so on have conditioned paleontological work. And this was also happening at the time when we got the sort of massive upsurge in paleo art, so kind of paleontological artwork, which was, riding off the immediate wave around Nash Conway and Koosman's Or Yesterdays, and really kind of very, very interesting work trying to overcome the art science divide. So it seemed like about, 10 or so years ago, there was a very kind of natural point of connection between the humanities, the arts, and the sciences around the public role of paleontology. But these different communities, so the culturally informed paleontologists, the humanities scholars, and some of the artists weren't really kind of talking to each other. And so I thought this was a kind of problem that needed to be sort of overcome. So this kind of led me to organize a series of workshops and a series of events, the first one of which was held in 2016, around this kind of theme of bringing people from different fields with interests in, this question of the public role of paleontology to discuss shared interests. And I was quite gratified that whoever I kind of raised this idea was thought it was a good idea. And I was also very, very lucky in getting funding from both my university and the UK Arts and Humanities Research Network. So I was able to hold about 6 in-person events and a number of kind of smaller ones over the last 9 or 10 years. And you can see the results of this, actually. I'll put this in the chat on the kind of network website at poppaleo.com, which if I can get the chat working, I can put in. So you can follow that. You can see various videos, blog posts, and so on. So I found that, we've kept this good group going for almost 10 years now, so that's quite a good innings, I suppose. And that it's been sort of very nice to see that humanities researchers, paleontologists, and artists can, get on, have mutually beneficial discussions, and, have a lot of common kind of intellectually and professionally. And, sometimes we do have either disagreements or things that are difficult to translate between the different communities, but this has always kind of worked more productively rather than causing problems, I found. And so, yeah, and so and so kind of having all this kind of material leading to some kind of publication and some sort of book was something I thought was very important to kind of crystallize and bring the discussions so far into a kind of clear form. And I'm very kind of happy that it being open access through UCL Press means that it can be kind of more widely engaged with by a greater variety of audiences. And there are kind of number of things around, the book that I think have been quite important to sort of draw out. So making sure that it kind of builds different positions, different perspectives together has been really, really important. Making it open access and sort of appeal and potentially to appeal to a much broader audiences outside of universities is really kind of important. Also, another kind of important thing around both the book and our wider discussions is I've been quite keen throughout all of these developments to get beyond just the kind of the sort of easy option of just saying, yay, everyone loves dinosaurs, isn't that great? But also to think about the kind of price that gets paid for that, about this massive cultural role and the sort of wider purchase of paleontology. And also, the potentially difficult sides to paleontology's public role and the public dimensions of science and academic work more generally. So lots of thinking about the sort of potentially difficult economic sides around paleontology, the connections between science and empire, science and race, all these sort of different things. And, so we're really kind of using this kind of topic of the public role of paleontology to deal with these more complicated questions. And so given that we're now at a time where, research and many kind of things around that are kind of seriously under threat in many different places, then I think this has become, more important in recent years rather than less, both, in intellectually engaging with these sorts of issues, but also, building communities of people with common interests and values. So that's the kind of background to the book. I won't really cover the content because, as we've said, it's available. You can all read it, and hopefully some people have looked at it already. And also you'll hear from the commentators on a minute. And I hope the book's gone down well. It's doing well in terms of downloads, so it's been out for about a month now, and we're close to 4,000 downloads already, which I think is quite good. No doubt, I think significantly inspired by Mark Whitten's excellent cover. But yeah, I'm very interested to hear what people think and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's well in time, which is very nice to hear. I mean, maybe a little bit of temporal grace for some of our others. Let's pass things over to our first commentator, Riley Black.
Thank you so much for having me here. I didn't contribute to this volume specifically. I did blurb it, but I've been a part of, Chris's work before at a conference, a few years ago, and I'd love to be again. But I'm just so glad that this book exists. I'm so glad that these conversations are happening and starting, because I feel like in paleontology, up until relatively recently, history was mostly being told by principally vertebrate paleontologists, especially those who worked on dinosaurs, and that it was sort of telling the story of the field from the inside, and what was taken as, the history was often anecdote or not necessarily always checked. One of my favorite examples of this, I noticed the book itself, behind you, Chris, in your library, in Stephen Jay Gould's essay on Dinomania in Dinosaur in a Haystack. He recalls being a child and being called fossil face, and that dinosaurs just were not popular when he was a kid. And yet, when you look at the record of paleontology in public, museum exhibits, headlines, things like John Ostrom even advising the dinosaurs for the Sinclair oil exhibits at the New York World's Fair in 1964 and 1965, there was an interest in dinosaurs, at least amongst the public. Even mutating into forms like Godzilla and things like that. It was the scientific interest that was different, and that distinction often isn't made. And I like that people are now questioning parts of these history, the divide between the scientific side and the public side, even the buildup of what we call Dinomania and the dinosaur renaissance. I'm sorry I was unable to make the conference last year, but I love that we are now going back to this pivotal event that I think previously had really just been told through books like The Hot-Blooded Dinosaurs or Bacher's work or things like that, and kind of taken almost at face value, when many of those ideas were percolating somewhere for decades prior. And this idea that I was asked by a book author about this not so long ago, who was writing a book about Jurassic Park, that there's this impression that Jurassic Park in particular, the novel and the film, kicked off Dinomania in the 1990s. And as someone who was a kid through the 1980s and went to her first dinosaur night in 1988 at preschool, dressing up with cereal and sandboxes and toys and all that stuff, I feel like there's a lot to dig into in terms of, for example, like dinosaur capitalism. How much money was actually involved in marketing dinosaurs, and why was that? And what was the relationship between some of the debates in the field and how it was percolating to the public? So even though we had this, pivotal year of 1993, it wasn't just Jurassic Park. The fact is we had Jurassic Park, Carnosaur, Prehysteria, Tanny and the T-Rex, and I think at least one other film come out that year, cover stories for National Geographic and Time. You had animatronic exhibits like Dynamation appearing all over the place and touring for quite some time before this. Years of small documentaries on television during a time which whatever was playing at the movies, whatever was on television, whatever the bestseller was, that is what everybody was engaging with, because we did not have this thing we're using to communicate right now accessible to the public. Things were not as dispersed as they are now in our internet era, where it was possible to go big. So even the role of technology and telecommunications in creating the image of dinosaurs and Dinomania and this fixture that we feel that it is, all of these things I feel like haven't been fully explored yet, but we're beginning to. And this volume, I think, is such an important step in continuing those conversations and figuring out how we got here, and all these questions that were perpetually asked. Why are these animals popular? Why are they not? Or why are they represented this way? What's the relationship between science, not just how is it done, but how it's ingested and then spat back out? The fact that often I've had paleontologists, often I disagree with them when they do this, take things in Jurassic Park as just like, oh yeah, raptors hunted in packs, we can assume that. I'm like, no, we absolutely can't. But how many papers we've had, for example, about things like T-Rex running speed, or all these things that move back and forth between the scientific and public realm, making this complicated relationship. So I'm absolutely thrilled that this volume exists. And I love that it contains not just history, but questioning of the history that we thought we knew, conversations about it. And my hope is that it leads to a broadening of the field in this respect, that these conversations very much continue. So thank you very much to Chris and everybody involved in bringing it together. I think it's absolutely phenomenal.
Wonderful. Thank you, Riley. Yes, good show of, you can use the clap function. Very nice. Let's move on to Natalia.
Okay, lovely hearing from Riley. Can you hear me all right? All good? Okay, excellent. So, that book is great. I always like reading about dinosaurs, but not directly about dinosaurs, other prehistoric animals, because you read so many technical texts, get used to it. But it's usually the technical texts and how they translate to actual public, it's its own magic that we sort of discuss, argue about, or is it just in the background? Because not every single person has the same approach to science communication. And that's reflected by this book. So there's a lot of elements, even there's different backgrounds of different authors and different topics. There's some topics that reoccur. But one thing that's kind of surprising is that provenance sometimes plays a huge amount in science communication and sometimes barely at all, which is quite interesting when you look at paleoanthropology and looking at origins of human development. From where the fossil came from, it's part of its identity, it's part of what it means to that given nation. It ties into the national identity. So you have the Peking man, you have the pull-down man, everything's sort of tied to the bigger geographical, social, political thing. But sometimes when you look at animals like Spinosaurus, the fact it's coming from Arabic North African country, it's usually completely vacant. So how do we sort of decide what fossils are geographically, social, politically relevant, and which are just, there's a cool creature that we have around, and it's detached from the geography and culture it's coming from, like it's happening to some charismatic taxa. And I think it's a bit of a problem because I like talking to people that are not in the museum, because I'm a museum worker. I talk to people going to museum every single day. We already have them. They're past the museum gates. We don't have to engage with them. They're on the right track. What's happening to people that aren't going to the museums? And to this informal research, when I go to hairdressers or just talk to random people in the bus stops, I ask them about dinosaurs, how much do they know, or try to do it organically, and from where they get the information about them. And surprisingly, not many people know that they have local dinosaurs or geology or paleontology. Most of them think it's something from a distant lands in a desert that you cannot do locally from a garden. And in Great Britain, almost every single part of the country has really impressive geological past and paleontology, but people are unaware of it. And if they are, they only think about Jurassic Coast because of Marianne and she's in Key Stage 2 kind of figure. And why is that? I guess maybe because our fossils, when we talk about them, about dinosaurs, and especially because they're most charismatic, they're usually not tied to certain geography. And if they are, they usually associate with US badlands. So anything about Spinosaurus, Arabic subcontinent is missing. But when you talk about the Peking man, suddenly China is in different conversation because it's like different type of conversations. I'm wondering what is the deciding factor of it? Like with Melon, the sleeping dragon, this guy is strictly tied to Chinese Revolution and paleontology, and its name itself is derived from actual, Mandarin. While other dinosaurs usually are coming from more classical backgrounds of so we're going from Latin and Greek, which are coming from the public school system that Britain had, which was class segregated. So you have this kind of weird, and it's usually the Latin names or Greek names don't signify animal coming from Latin-speaking regions or Greek-speaking regions. This is like a uniform thing. And those small things make fossils from certain regions completely detached from local people. And yeah, that was kind of surprising. Those things sometimes provenance plays huge amount in what the fossil represents to general public and how it's perceived by general public, and sometimes it's completely detached and it's just a ephemeral thing that sort of exists for everyone within the dinosaur sphere. And I'm wondering if we can sort of start having more conversations about how we reframe fossils, and especially fossils that are not related to evolution of humanity, but just general life, because it's cosmopolitan and it does play into something like the parachute science. So the thing itself talks a lot about George Simpson or Roy Chapman Andrews, and they all based in Central Asia or Venezuela, but the research is not really about Central Asia or Venezuela. The animals exist on their own thing, and that sort of is a reflection of the parachute science that was happening at the time and of the colonial values. So yeah, it opened a lot of things. I felt like, oh, that'll be a cool thing to discuss with other people. I'm glad a lot of things popped up. It's like, oh yes, we were arguing this, like Elsa's chapters about use of derived or successful or primitive that we use in science communication and on publications, and how to use them to not propagate sometimes racist or colonial ideas. It's a great reason. So I recommend anybody to just go for it and make links between different essays and texts, and just like, oh, that's interesting that pops up, and that's interesting that it's just in this one section but doesn't carry on to the other one. And yeah, I think that's it. I think I'm doing all right for time. I have so many different strands I want to follow, but yeah. Okay, I guess I say, like I said, go read any of the chapters. There's a lot of different topics. You might resonate with ones more than the others, but it's great reading them as a single unit and seeing those connection spots and seeing the blind spots we have as science communicators and how we approach paleontology to general public, because people that will be going for this book already, we have them, they love paleo. It's trying to get people that are not reading those books. And that might be just including huge reframing of how we look at dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals, which are charismatic and resonate with public. Okay, another speaker.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I'm sure there'll be time for you to bring out more of these threads later on. Let's move on to Alison.
Amazing, thank you. In my comments, I want to focus on the communities that coalesce around fossil animals and the way that paleontology generates relationships across space and time. And because I'm a cultural historian, I'm going to insist on putting some words and images in front of your faces. So let me just share my screen. You see a green box, I believe. Okay. So, in the introduction to this book, Chris reminds us that paleontology, in fact, demands cross-disciplinary conversations, multiple forms of expertise. And we see our authors in this collection questioning inherited narratives, as Natalia was saying, bringing in new characters, new voices into the conversation, focusing on the contributions of non-scientists. And this is important because, as we see in multiple chapters, the boundary work that occurs within science can exclude people or devalue the work, the labor of particular contributors. So I'm going to just give you a couple quotes. Focus on the bold. There are a lot of words that are going to pop up, but focus on the bold. We're first introduced to this concept in the chapter by Zishuan and Lucas in the context of the history of paleontology in China. So they bring in Guerin's concept of boundary work, which can, define what kind of conduct, what kind of questions are appropriate, but it can also create these hierarchies that exclude people, prevent them from asserting their knowledge claims as legitimate, right? And Oliver brings this into in the context of mass media, where we see that scientific knowledge is in fact co-produced. It's not just the scientists who create knowledge about the deep past. There are lots of folks. We see this in Vicky's chapter as well, and so many of the other contributions. So I wanted to offer a couple brief examples of how fossil animals bring people, communities together in other ways. And I'm just going to put some advertisements in front of your faces. Riley already mentioned Sinclair Oil. This is a very famous example. I'm going to give you some modern examples. So I'm going to show you some stills from this cotton commercial from a few years back. We open with an establishing shot of a father and a daughter, okay? Camera pulls in. We see the dad holding a photo. He says, "This is me when I was 5 in my favorite dinosaur t-shirt made of cotton. Now it's Violet's favorite t-shirt." Camera cuts to Violet, who gives us this adorable rawr, and we can see the shirt more clearly. It's a sauropod riding a skateboard. This is an ad for cotton. It's asking us to see cotton as a fabric that stands the test of time, worth the investment, right? You can hand it down, and when you need something new, buy cotton, right? That's the message we get. But the shared interest here is not in cotton, right? The shared interest is the dinosaur, okay? And we see the same message in a campaign for the Smithsonian's Deep Time exhibit. So this is from 2019. Even though the exhibit includes some 700 plant and animal specimens, the initial promotion for that exhibit focused on the dinosaurs. So here's one example. Return to when dinosaurs ruled, like when you were 6. Okay, we've got this wobbly sketch of a triceratops clearly drawn by a kid. It casts a skeletal shadow as if the actual dinosaur wouldn't exist if the child didn't draw it first. And we know dinomania is not a universal facet of childhood. but it's sold as if it is, right? And this adds inclusive second person pronoun. This you invites everyone into the memory, whether or not it was that onlooker's childhood, right? Here's another example. This ad tells people to bring your inner child and your actual child. So this one suggests that fossil animals link us to the deep past, to people across generations as well, right? Allowing access to childhood wonder and opportunities to connect with literal children, right? Parents, kids going to the museum together. Whether or not the premise of these ads is true or universal, the advertisers deem it compelling, right? And I am sharing these examples as a kind of yes and to the book's invitation to think about communities, boundary work, and co-production of ideas. So to wrap, I want to offer some prompts that the authors might take up in discussion. And imagine that Violet is putting these prompts to you, okay? How do communities coalesce around fossil life other than dinosaurs? What's different about the way in which, mammals, invertebrates, fossil plants bring communities together? How has collaboration actually impacted your work? Whether you co-authored your piece for this collection or, whether you've just been participating in this network for years, right? What's different about your work because of these collaborations, these conversations that you've been having? This third one is a bit silly, but I am curious about what paleontology in private as a follow-up collection might look like, right? The privatization of fossils is an ongoing issue, and I'm curious to know what those studies might look like, right? Keeping fossils deep time out of the public. And then the last thing I want to put to you, this is inspired by Will and Mark's chapter. They're talking about the Spinosaurus as this protean thing, right? It's changing. The interpretations are changing. The stories we tell about fossils and the deep past are changing. Okay, there's a parallel here I see between how we change our stories about extinct animals and how childhood is this just protean thing, right? A protracted phase of change. So those are just some invitations to potentially take up in conversation later. And thank you so much for all of your contributions.
Thank you. Wonderful, Alison. And let's have our last contribution from Mike Benton.
Thanks very much, Adrian. And I'm delighted to be here. And the book is fantastic. I especially applaud the open access aspect. I think this is something we all need to be very thoughtful about. So many scholarly books are priced in a way that makes them inaccessible, which is not good for us as authors, and it's certainly not good for our various fields. I'm very pleased as well, the book has authors from China and Argentina. I think particularly the chapter about China shows us we have to remember we're not just talking about dinosaurs in English language culture in Europe or in North America. And I'm sure there's a lot more thinking to be done and speaking to people from other language cultures. Obviously, China is a huge nation with a huge history, and getting an insight in the English language privileges us. We're honored to be able to read that. Jin Sichuan was a fantastic PhD student of mine, and he happily translates, and he's fluent in English and Chinese, so an ideal person and an expert dinosaur person. So my interest in dinosaurs, I'm a paleontologist. I have been working in paleontology professionally for a number of years. When I started, I was writing kids' books, I've written textbooks, and over the last 20 years, we've run a program in Bristol called the Bristol Dinosaur Project, which has been funded at various levels, particularly when we had national lottery money. We were rolling in money. We even had a car. We employed 2 people. But of course, the comedy of these public education efforts is that the money flows and then they expect you to somehow pick it up and cover it later by other means. And The universities don't have money to invest. They're happy to encourage public engagement, but not to fund it. But the Bristol Dinosaur Project we were able to use, so this gave me insights which are rather obvious, but maybe worth stating, which is that you can use dinosaurs or any fossils really as a way in with kids at different ages. When they're young, they just love it. And if you hand them an ammonite, this is a real fossil, they are jumping and bouncing around the room. They just absolutely love it. And the one good thing is to observe that even though they can see sophisticated animations and films of ancient life, actually handling the real specimen, even better, a T-Rex tooth, handling the real thing. So that authenticity is good. And I'm sure that goes hand in hand with the fact that we like to go to concerts, we like to go to galleries, even though we can actually see it all and hear it all on our computers. So the authenticity. With older kids, how do you get a class of 15-year-olds to get excited? They will not jump around the room. They will not pass fossils around and squeal and shout. But the way we do it is CSI. It's a detective story. And this leads me to the key point of what we've been trying to do recently in Bristol, that a lot of the paleontological inference, the way the science works, has been moving. And we can tell the 15-year-old stories about how we can determine the color of dinosaurs, for example. And at first, of course, they're skeptical and they think, oh, well, this is just guessing. And then you actually explain the chain of inference. We know this, we observe this, we know this following thing, therefore we can conclude that this is the color. And it's scientific in the sense that each point along that chain of inference, each of those assumptions can be tested. So it's a hypothesis. And this is true of calculating dinosaur running speeds from trackways. I think this is what people are more familiar with. And various other areas of the science have been moving from a classically speculative field to what we would argue is testable, because we're applying the uniformitarian principles. The way the world works today gives us certain determinations. The spacing of tracks tells you the speed. And if it works today, why would it not work in the Jurassic? You know, that kind of thinking. The other thread, of course, which is relevant to the book and to this group, I think, is how we look at, or what do we think dinosaurs looked like? And of course, there are so many wonderful images, compilations showing how Iguanodon has changed through the centuries, or how Spinosaurus has changed. And you can show these images, this picture from 1850, this model from 1870. And I'm sure we're all familiar with those sort of changing images through time. And how do you view that? Of course, a simplistic thing would be to say, oh, well, they're all very stupid. They got it wrong. I think we're more sophisticated. We would realize, well, no, nobody was stupid. Both the artists and the scientists at the time were attempting to present the best image that they could based upon available evidence and to some extent, I guess, available materials. So this is an area that Vicky Cools, who is here and wrote a chapter in the book about Gertie the dinosaur, the beginning of the filmic dinosaur. What would they have done had these early animators had CGI? Could they have done more? Or would their dinosaurs still look similar? Would Gertie look similar, even though rendered in what we might say is a more sophisticated medium? And so I suppose my final point is about the interplay, and this is something Vicky and I have been discussing. This is very much within Vicky Cools's PhD thesis in Bristol, which we've characterized by the expression, this is more applied to the paleontologists, I think, than to the artists, the expression, how far do you go? We've sort of noticed at different points that professors express, I should say scientists, paleo professors, express a degree, you can have a scale from left to right, a degree of how far they will go. At the far left, they won't go very far at all. They will say, I've got this pile of bones, here they are. I will describe the shapes of the bones. I might dare to go so far as to say this is from a fossil elephant, but that's it. all the way through to the right-hand side where they are speculating wildly. The artist asks a question, what do the babies look like? The scientist says, we've got no idea, we have no fossil babies, but I'm willing to speculate based on whatever. So that spectrum, and you might have thought, because of course, what is it that the left-hand professor uses to justify their caution? It could be, I don't want to look like a fool. I don't want to make a mistake. It could be, I'm an elite scientist. I have special training. I'm not going to share with you the knowledge I have. I'm going to somehow stand aloof. If you ask me a question, Sphinx-like, I may answer that question, or maybe not. I will decide. And they might sneer at those who are more speculative and say, oh, that person is just cheapening their work. They are willing to talk to artists. They're willing to do this and that. But you might have thought the cautious one would always say, we need more evidence. We need more evidence. And so you would predict from over the last 200 years, by now, do we not yet have enough evidence to move us over to the right? And still we have that debate. So those of you who recall Walking with Dinosaurs may remember the extraordinary uproar about the piddling Postosuchus. So in the first program of Walking with Dinosaurs, they showed a Triassic reptile urinating. And this became a cause célèbre in the press. Professors of paleontology were saying, no, it wouldn't do that. And others would say, well, how do you know? And so this went on, rolling on year by year. And they were basing it on certain knowledge that birds don't produce liquid urine, they produce blah, blah, blah. And we even found a wonderful blog post where somebody had a picture of an ostrich urinating copiously. If you don't believe this, then surely. And so I love all that, you know, and I love making fun of the left-hand end dinosaur experts because they're being very stuffy and silly. And of course, my view would be, and I'll finish with this, that what's the role of the scientist in this whole field? It's to be as daring as they can. And therefore, if there is a question, how does this thing look? How does it behave? You do your best to answer it. And you have to accept, of course, that a year later, this is the lot of all academics, a year later, you'll be proven wrong. That's okay. That's the way it goes. So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we're now moving on to the sort of second chunk of our book launch. And here there's supposed to be a sort of discussion between the respondents and any of the book authors in the room who want to jump in. I don't have the kind of miraculous memory that enables me to tell whether anyone is necessarily a book author or not, so we'll work on a kind of honor system. I think a good way of, you know, as we will for the main discussion, we may as well use a kind of hand thing if people want to be put in a kind of queue, just for the purposes of like keeping stuff under control. I suspect otherwise people will just start jumping in. So if anyone would like to start and respond to anything that's been said, feel free to raise their hand. You could also put something in the chat if you want. I can see there's already some fun things going on in the chat. We may start bringing some of those things out as we shift to the more sort of everyone can pile in stage of our discussion. So does anyone have like an initial thing they would like to raise or discuss? All right, I will have a thing. And then, oh, Vicky, do you want to come in? Go for it.
Sorry, everybody. I waved at you because I can't find the raised hand symbol because I'm not used to using Zoom for so long. One thing I just want to pick up on that this idea of the two-way relationship between the sort of popular culture, the public, and the science. I'm personally interested in, I think it's a three-way relationship, and I think the three-way relationship goes between the public, the art, which includes the sort of animation and so on, and the science. And I sort of mooted looking at this as part of my PhD, as Mike mentioned, and he's one supervisor, and my other supervisor kept saying, focus, you know, don't get distracted. And it might well be more of a sort of cultural and social history type issue. But I find that that's been raised again. That absolutely fascinates me, and you know, the almost like sometimes the public reaction drives what the science research does, and both are then reacting to either the imagery or the film or the media side. So it's something I'd, you know, be very keen to sort of follow up, really.
So Vicky, you're talking about the relationship between sort of the way in which sometimes scientific questions, at least in paleontology, are very much driven by public perceptions, and there's this kind of back and forth between them.
Yes.
Yeah, I recall many years ago I ran a workshop for philosophers and paleontologists, and I, of course, went in and said things a bit similar to what Mike was saying about, oh, speculation is very important. This helps explain the success of paleontology. And the first thing a paleontologist said in the room was, oh, well, paleontologists are successful because we're really good at getting money.
Well,
And I think that explains a little bit of it, right? Because paleontology tends to, it has that public, because it has that public persona, and as Chris pointed out, because it is quite fairly fringe in terms of academic science, right? Naturally, there's going to be a using whatever levers you can to get the money to do your research. So it's not surprising, I think, that paleontology in particular tends to have that kind of rich connection. That's only one aspect of it, of course.
yeah, I mean, very briefly, some of you know me. I'm actually technically doing my PhD in history of art at Bristol with the link into paleontology, because I'm looking at the whole relationship of dinosaurs with visual culture. But one of the things I do look at is the fact that is where it happens, where the art or the artists have actually then have an influence back into the science. And that's why, you know, I'm just interested in, I think it's a three-way thing, but I don't want to sort of monopolize it anymore. But that fascinated me, so thank you.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. No, just on the point of paleontologists being very good at getting money, which I think would be surprising to many kind of paleontologists. But I think that does kind of raise an interesting point in that, you know, paleontology in kind of current sort of academic funding systems, you can use the cachet and the popular cachet around the discipline to write things that might be appealing to grant funding councils, but it still comes, I think, way down. Most other sciences. But what is or has been historically distinct about paleontology is paleontologists have been very creative about where they've been able to get funding from, which, you know, has in some ways been beneficial to the field, but in other ways has been led it in some quite other different directions. So Riley, for example, mentioned the Central Asiatic expeditions and Roy Chapman Andrews going into Mongolia in the 1920s and, you know, plundering all sorts of fossils, all sorts of kind of archaeological sites. But they were essentially funded through large scale, you know, US businessmen, through magazine and corporate sponsorship, and through product placement as well. So all of their scientific papers and all of their kind of public statements were all, the Dodge motor cars allowed us to go through the Mongolian wilds with all this kind of, orientalizing sort of presentations of the indigenous and sort of local people. And so, so paleontologists have been able to do this, but it's then sort of led them into this entanglement with all of these sort of, often quite dark, often quite unpleasant larger scale interests. And so it's one of these areas where, you know, it's been beneficial to the science in some areas. It's let the scientists do particular things. But, you know, there has been this price that's come with it in many different ways.
Yeah, I think the claim wasn't that they're rich, but that paleontologists of necessity have a certain entrepreneurialness about them. So that was very nicely put, Chris. Mike.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question for Riley, in fact, or a partial comment and a question. I guess, Riley, you've been writing about paleontology, observing, but writing, but importantly, selling your work. So the point is you can't write in a frivolous fashion or without thinking about the audience. So have you seen a change over the years in terms of what the market is interested in, or what your employers, Smithsonian, National Geographic, is there a limit to how many dinosaur articles they are willing to receive?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, because there absolutely is, especially now. So over the past 30, 35 years, magazine publishing, as it once was, has almost entirely collapsed. So, in the 80s and by the early 90s, you had a number of glossy magazines. You had a greater number of magazines like Omni that have entirely disappeared now, National Geographic having different interests, a lot more funding to send people around. I have my career through the rise in blogging, for example, and magazines invested in that, and now they no longer do. And at this point, almost every magazine that I write for, whether it's Scientific American, New Scientist, National Geographic, less so Smithsonian. Smithsonian I quite like working with because they will take more evergreen things, or things that I feel like, okay, let's synthesize all this into something about I just did a piece for them about the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, which has no news hook. It's just an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people know about. But most of those others, they want something that's going to get a lot of clicks, get a lot of eyeballs, drive advertising revenue because there isn't support. So there's not only a limit to the number in terms of dinosaur saturation, but they want big stories. They are no longer going to get coverage on, okay, here's a new species. As we so often know, you get a new fossil animal, and sometimes often it's just a part of that animal. And unless there's spectacular art to go with it, or it's the first or the biggest or more superlative, it's less likely to get coverage. So I think there actually has been a detrimental change in science reporting and coverage. So it's only very few animals, usually charismatic megafauna of one sort or another, usually researchers same people that you typically hear of, and it takes a lot of effort to get those other stories out there. In terms of books, what I've seen change was, this might be entirely personal, it's colored by my personal experience. When I was writing more in terms of a professional, so I've learned a whole lot about dinosaurs and prehistoric life, I'm going to tell you all about it. Those would do okay, particularly wouldn't sell very well. Critically would do well, wouldn't typically sell. I think partially from my end, because I'm not an academic paleontologist, I don't have a PhD, I didn't have the sort of authority that people were expecting. So you have a book like Steve Bruzzati's Rise and Reign of the Dinosaurs that did very well because that's like the entire package a publisher can run with. You have an recognized expert in the field writing a book about dinosaurs, etc. But The Last Days of the Dinosaurs and the book they have coming out next week, When the Earth Was Green, seem to have picked up a lot more interest because it's thinking about the living animals. This is no longer me sitting here, trying to digest the science and just present it to the public because they're interested. It's basically trying to go on a nature walk, in the ancient past, and thinking about, okay, all the science that we do, all these things to reconstruct and restore these organisms, what would they have been like if you could see them? And I think that is a perennial source of fascination for people. There are, especially amongst kids, which you're mentioning earlier, I think, especially when many of us, encounter fossils and these ideas about deep time and evolution, there some of us who want to be that paleontologist. But I think for many people, it's just, what is all this for, if not imagining what life was like back then? And I feel like there's been a resurgent interest in that, that certainly could go along with sort of, the BBC Natural History Unit documentaries and, the Apple TV series on dinosaurs and prehistoric life that's been out. So I feel like there's been a bit of a shift in what people are drawn to.
Thank you.
Great. Let's move on to Will.
Thank you. Lucas, if you were speaking to Riley's point directly, please feel free to jump ahead of me.
Sure. It is pretty direct, so I'll take that. Thank you. I guess it's more of an invitation. Sorry, Will. What I'm about to do is actually pass it on to other people yet again, because it's more of an what I was wondering about is how that dynamic that Riley was describing, and Mike, I think in a way was also thinking about, it has also affected the history of philosophy, anthropology, I don't know, of paleontology. It's too bad Derek's not here, because I think Derek Turner among us, he was one of the first. But I certainly remember when I was doing my PhD, I finished my PhD in 2012 with a dissertation about dinosaurs. And there was definitely a sense at the time that there was something a little bit risky about doing a project about dinosaurs, because precisely of what we're talking about, which is that they're not very serious. And in order to do a project like that, well, it's really wonderful how Chris has put this book together explicitly in conversation with artists and thinking about popular culture and how it intersects with and interacts with the more you might say elite culture, I don't know, of paleontology. But that's been a challenge. Just speaking personally, I feel like that the academic world for those of us who are not practicing paleontologists but are interested in what paleontologists are doing has opened up quite a lot. So I'm actually quite curious to hear, Chris, since you ran the Pop Paleo group now for, I guess, over a decade, it sounds like, whether you've noticed that too, like whether you've noticed any changes in the last 10 or so years around the academic study of paleontology.
I think the academic study of paleontology seems to have risen quite a lot over the past decade. Partly because it is being tied to sort of larger scale questions. Like there is some material that kind of does latch on to the idea about paleontology and its connections with childhood and youth culture, and that's all kind of very interesting and has kind of led to some important insights. But then I think a large interesting point that's come out of the more recent material, both, academically, but also I think in terms of some of the more kind of middle to like highbrow sort of popular culture, is how paleontology and deep time have been connected to bigger issues which are of current sort of larger scale social concerns. So within paleontology itself and some of the science communication around paleontology, then linking it with some of the claims around, cultural restitution and, the fact that many fossils do have quite a deep colonial heritage and were kind of extracted during either, actual sort of formal colonialism or more sort of in the kind of more informal parachute science that Natalia was talking about. I think that has come out quite strongly in the academic literature and also in some of the sort of journalistic reporting too. And so I think that's led it to one sort of important aspect. Another important aspect where I think things have changed quite a bit over the past decade is the connection of paleontology and deep time with the environment and with ideas around both, well, climate change and biodiversity loss in the more kind of public context, and debates over the Anthropocene in more academic context, and the way that these sort of link together. And I think both of these are leading in quite interesting ways to making paleontology and its cultural role not just for kids, basically, and making it a more serious topic because it can connect with these much bigger issues around sort of, social, environmental and kind of economic side of things. Where these are also two of the areas that I think about most, but I know that a lot of people are also now working around the issues that Alison was raising about the rise of, hugely well-capitalized trade in fossil material and the kind of value and the price that gets put on things like, dinosaur fossils and so on. So that's also taking it into a much larger and a much more sort of wide area of cultural and economic engagement.
And before we move on, just to make sure, if you're looking for the cursed hand function, there's a react button that you'll find down below where there is a lovely wonky heart. If you click on that, you will then see the raise hand function. Zoom decides to move this every couple of months to keep us on our toes, so far as I can tell. Does anyone want to speak specifically else to Lucas's question? Cool, let's move on to Will.
Thanks so much. And actually just quickly to bounce off what Chris has just said, I've really found that myself as well as a literary critic who works on this stuff. One of the few, when I tell other literary critics that I'm doing a book about dinosaurs, they invariably do two things. The first thing they say is, "Oh, that's amazing. That's a really cool idea. And you're so lucky." And the second thing they say is, "They're letting you do that." And it's like, well, you clearly think it's a good idea. So it's kind of interesting that those kind of high-low cultural prejudices kind of continue to exist. I mean, it's not particular surprise perhaps about English literature from the outside, but I'm still surprised by it. The thing I was going to do was bring things back to the questions that Alison so usefully raised at the end of her talk, and just to say that I was particularly struck by the one about paleontology in private, and I would love to hear some more thoughts about that. When you brought it up, Alison, one of the things that was going through my mind is, I mean, you were speaking very much about what happens when fossils move into private hands, And I think that's a really important point. But I was also thinking of the relative privacy of museum stores. Most publicly owned fossils are not actually accessible, really, unless you have the right contacts or qualifications. So there's a kind of privacy in that, and there's of course the thrill of getting to see some of that behind the scenes stuff. But I actually was also thinking a lot about how paleontology looks in the privacy of our own heads, and how we are all individually figuring these large kind of social webs to ourselves. One of the things that I do sometimes with people I'm introducing this subject to is I say, just take a minute to write down what happens in your head when I say the word dinosaur. What are you thinking of? What are you picturing? And invariably, some of them are picturing stills from films, some of them animations, some of them skeletons in museums. It's actually there are things that come back, like the Jurassic Park T-Rex is very popular, but that word is evocative of a huge number of different private images that have all been put there by these public phenomenon. And I think that often, and this was raised brilliantly by Mike with reference to Walking with Dinosaurs, the problem is similar to that when a book gets turned into a movie, right? And people, you have the fidelity problem. People watch the movie who love the book, and they're like, oh, that's not right. That's not mine. That's not what Frodo looks like. And I think thinking about in detail more about how that is part of the visualization of paleontology as well. That mismatch between the anticipation that our own imaginative sense of the past world creates, and then what we are given by the science and the technology, I think it would be just a fascinating thing to talk more about. So thank you, Alison, very much, and I'll stop.
I might very quickly take a bit of prerogative and jump in there. I think one of the things that I thought of, which I think is very different, but also quite connected with thinking about sort of paleontology in private, was, of course, a lot of the work that people like Caitlin Wiley have done about sort of the invisibility of various aspects of research work done in paleontology. And what's interesting, of course, is that those, making invisible of various elements of paleontological work feeds exactly into lots of the stuff that Will was talking about how people then go and perceive sort of the objects of paleontological knowledge, right? It's, what people you get to see doing the work makes a difference to how you then take in the information you're getting and things like that. So it seems like there is a really interesting nexus of stuff hanging out around that set of ideas that'd be really fun to think about. So maybe it wasn't as silly as you said. Natalia, do you want to come in?
I guess my point links to the main conversation of what is public and what is private, because we talk about paleontology in public, but why do we treat public as this big amorphous thing? Because it's composed of many people, and when we talk about paleontology in SciComm and art, that's displayed in museums, in journals like National Geographic, in scientific journals, in books, we are talking about specific demographic that accesses those resources, which are usually white middle-class people. So when you go to people going to museums, it'll be certain demographic. People buying science books or expensive magazines like National Geographic, there'll be a certain demographic. And it's mainly because of various, there'll be different tiers of why that is happening. Even free museums like in UK have additional layers of entry. So if somebody wants to visit the Natural History Museum of London and they're working class, the museum entry is free, but there's so many steps to go to the museum, which is in central city, which you have to, get a transport to because usually you live out. You don't have time for it because time is money. You have to pay for kids when you're out in the museum, and central London is expensive. So even free activities which are meant to be erasing cultural socio-economic barriers are there. So when we talk about the public, how much of the public do we actually mean? Because in paleontology, even actual paleontology, so when you go to SVPCA, or paleontology that's engaged by public hobbyists and general public like Ted Zuccon, there's a lot of the demographic you see, it's mainly guys of certain age and certain socioeconomic class. So how do we break public into actual public, which means everyone, rather than just certain demographic, and we treat, okay, they access those media, that's the conversations that are happening in that sphere. Migrants are not here. People of color are barely even here in professional and casual circles. How do we break to them when the things you're using to communicate with them are not really resources they access day to day? And if it can be answered or sort of discussed across the rest of the panel, that would be great, because I have no idea how to solve it. And working in the museum sector is kind of disappointing when you see the list, and it's just another rich family from there has master education, another going to the museum, having the questions, with kids having enough resources to follow them, and local working class people not even engaging with the museum.
Let's go to Ilja, who we haven't heard from yet.
One moment, can you hear me? Right. I just wanted to go briefly back to the question, to Lucas's remark about what has changed in the last 10 years as popular paleontology, Chris's project, has been going on. And personally, I think the main thing that has changed that he has even made me look at my own text of not even that long ago with, well, maybe not embarrassment, but some introspection, is the colonial element. The whole discussion of colonialism was something in the discussion of the history of paleontology was something that wasn't really there even 7-8 years ago to that extent. So it is really, I think if this project is going to go any further, I think that's something that we really have to include, and that wasn't as present in earlier days.
That makes sense, yeah. Let's use Riley to transition us into the anyone can ask questions section of the evening. People who, you guys can still talk too, it's fine. And so just to remind you, if you want to get put on the queue, you could just write your name in the chat or something. You could write a question in the chat if you yourself don't want to speak. I'll read it out in my sonorous New Zealand accent. Or use the chat function if you can find it to raise your hand. So you start doing that if you wish. Riley, take it away.
Sure, Kate. I hope this kind of ties together a few of the threads, because it's been occurring to me listening to everybody speak, especially Alice and what you shared, Natalia. We have this talking about paleontology and the public, but of course, dealing with boundary issues, how do they intersect with each other, especially in terms of paleontologists themselves, paleontologists as members of the public, especially given the generational turnover and how paleontology has been popularized, the ideas that we take up, the imagery that we take up, especially as kids, is looking at everybody else share their models. I've got a little Torosaurus on my desk. When that paper came out suggesting that Torosaurus was Triceratops, I was like, I don't like it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to try and keep an open mind. But I remember being a kid and there was a show called Dino Riders with the Torosaurus in it. And I had the figure and I loved it. And I had a personal affection for this animal the same way that many people have for Brontosaurus or things like that. And I don't think it's just the public who feel this way, that especially during our formative eras, becoming paleontologists or getting involved in the field, what background are we coming from? What imagery, what sort of hero stories are we taking in about Roy Chapman Andrews or George Gaylord Simpson or whoever it is from our backgrounds, and how that gets involved in what we might feel defensive about or protective of, because there is so much interpretation and the checking that we have to do, not just that we reach level of paleontologist and then suddenly the public's on the outside, but how our own public basically understanding of dinosaurs involves who we become and how we shape the field once we're in it.
That's a great question. I'm just going to go straight to Joshua because I have nothing intelligent to say.
Thank you. No, I wanted to pick up on that, but also what Natalia said about the construction of the public and stuff like that. I think it's so easy to the public, having this big vague term looming around and referring to it when talking about it's kind of like an us and them dichotomy that is broken up there. But I also noticed that from the other point of view, with the construction of community, in a way that people talk about the paleo community or paleo or paleo Twitter, for example, and people are like that. People think like that, stuff like that. While I think over the last 10, maybe even more years since the internet is around, certainly the community has grown to such an extent that we have so many opinions and ways to ways paleo is talked about, that it's no longer as easy to group people like that, even in the professional field. And what also Rilo mentions there with Torosaurus or Toroceratops, and so we'll debate about that stuff and the emotional attachment people have, and it's so easy as people who work in paleo to think that we are above this, and I try to get away from that. I have the saying, love the process, not the illusions that it creates. But at the end of the day, it's so hard even to like get attached to simple stuff like a name. We saw that with Saurophaganax recently, a big allosaur from the Morrison Formation that is now proposed to be not an actual thing. The fossil still exists, but apparently it's now Allosaurus. They gave it a new name, but I prefer to call it Allosaurus SP. And so many people are, oh no, this is horrible, and it's just a few letters at the end of the day, but the king of lizard eaters still has its fans.
That's really nicely put, Joshua. I suppose there's a kind of weird relationship as well between thinking about the sort of public affection, which is partly the scientific affection as well, but it's partly between, I think, the public feels kind of deeply upset and lied to when they think scientists have said, and this might be a way perhaps of pushing back against Mike's suggestion earlier that scientists should openly speculate in public, is that, of course, public does have this perception of scientists being people, and they shouldn't, but of scientists coming down and delivering objective truth in this kind of way. And so when someone says, you know, there's a planet called Pluto, or there's a dinosaur called, you know, Brontosaurus or whatever, these things get sort of fixed in our ontologies. Those are the things that exist. And so then having the scientists come and go, oh, we were wrong, which in science is, I mean, I love the Torosaurus Triceratops debate. I think it's fascinating, right? Very, very cool stuff. I happen to not care much about ceratopsids until that came out, so I didn't have the same emotional reaction, right? I'm sure if it had been some other megafauna, I would have been heartbroken. But the thing that I think it also reveals something about the kind of things the public expects from science, and that not really being what science is quite in the business of doing. If no one else wants to sort of come in, there is a few things in the chat I might sort of draw attention to. So Steve Foote has sort of raised a question about different, let's say, mediums by which one might go about engaging with the public. So as opposed to more, let's call them legacy mediums, such as science books, museums, that kind of thing. There's various, mostly sort of social media kind of content. I think there's, in my experience, quite a lot of that already, although rarely done by folks who are also writing books, let's put it that way. So if anyone would like to jump in and sort of discuss those issues about different ways of paleontological science being engaged with, that would be very welcome. While people think about that, Michael. Michael, do you want to come in? Yep, there we go.
Yeah, sorry, I'm pressing buttons. Hello. Actually, it ties into both of those. Like, one thing someone said there was how Riley was saying, like, when they were young, their favorite dinosaurs, one of their favorite dinosaurs was Torosaurus, and the Torosaurus Triceratops debate and everything else. And I think something we have to recognize is that we're in a rather unique position as a science, in that many of us as children got involved in it through exposure to fantastical media and fantastical imagery. And a lot of the amateurs and the communications and everything that goes on in public sense is very much still tied to that. We're getting into it in the same way we get into superheroes. And the communication moves on. Like the Saurophaganax thing, it's very much, I think you made a really great point of, like, scientists are supposed to present almost like an objective truth when they communicate, and the public reacts so poorly when they feel like they've been misled. But I think it's also like, you're telling me Superman's not real. Like the Tyrannosaurus debate from a few years ago about what species was what. It was like you had taken the biggest science figurehead really in the world and said, oh, it's not what you think it is. And people reacted like they were finding out like someone was being recast in the MCU. But You're also talking about how to engage with the public in different ways, and just like, you know, I'm part of the team. We're writing books about D&D, and we've done D&D dinosaur books, and we put in a lot of science into that. And I think it's sometimes I think we limit it a bit too much in how we approach science communication into very strictly semi-academic ones, like taking academic information and putting it into like a documentary vibe or a you know, a popular science vibe. I think by getting into other areas like fantasy media or book media and bring in real science, like our fiction media rather, and bringing in real science into that, I think that you engage people without realizing they're being engaged. So I'm pressing buttons again.
Okay, thanks. Mark, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Steve's question about bringing our information to the public, because that's now what I do essentially. You know, writing books and creating artwork and things for people. And I think what Steve's question triggered in my brain is how, obviously, yes, on one hand, it's very easy to put information out into the public now, particularly through channels like YouTube and Instagram, etc. But it's doing that in a way which is sort of meaningful and that is, you know, that goes beyond the superficial. And I think what I, you know, my response to Steve's question is doing that in a way where it's actually sustainable for individuals. So obviously museums can do this, but museums often aren't the ones who are really putting out the most in-depth information. A lot of the main museum social media channels are actually quite superficial. It'll be, here's a photograph from our archives, and a few facts about that, but you know, there's not much in the way of engagement. It's very much as here it is and it's done. And so to be an individual who can provide that sort of more in-depth information, you know, it requires you to be very available. At the same time, you then find yourself thinking, how do I make a living doing this? And I think this is where the challenge is that to be a person out there providing that information, there's just not many. I don't know if this is a level of interest thing. You know, there's just not enough people who want to hear about this stuff, you know, in terms of to monetize like a YouTube channel. But yeah, it's like where are the opportunities to do that? And yeah, it's something I think about a lot, you know.
Is Mark frozen there? Okay, so you always wonder whether I've frozen. Oh, he's back. Mark, we lost you. We lost you at the end there. If you want to finish off your sentence.
I think that's me. Our internet connection is quite patchy. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can now.
No, they can't. Oh.
Okay, maybe we'll take this as a chance to move over to Natalia. If Mark, if you want to make any other important points, throw it in the chat.
Okay, sort of continuing on other points of how do we sort of migrate communicating science with other people from more less traditional ways. So I'm moving away from blogs and books and museums. And for me, I have this initial kind of mental blockage because I know TikTok is great for young people. It's cross-cultural, it's cross-class system. But I found those short forms mediums quite scary for science communication and antithetical to science communication as it should be. So the best way of doing it will be going to the communities and actually handling them, fossils, doing, you know, physical engagement, playing into this strengths and weaknesses, because every community will be different and have different requirements and different ways of approaching different narratives and other things. But then you have to have a lot of resources and time to do it. And there's not enough money for the SciComm is not very well sponsored. It's something that's sort of reoccurring over the thing. So I have no idea how to approach it because you can go for TikTok, but I really don't want people to be learning facts and science from TikTok or Twitter because short-form mediums are not a good way to teach complex issues, and they will not really stick, and they will be filled with other disinformation or things you cannot control. And when you sort of put actual information within layers of different disinformation, you have no idea which things will be interpreted correctly or not, and you can sort of tackle it when you have, you know, multi-sensory, multi-source engagement for a person. Then they can ask questions and there's a conversation. You're not speaking at them, you're speaking with them, which is very hard to do online in a way. So I have no idea how to tackle it, but I have no idea how Mark is feeling about monetizing online content or doing content that's might be not very the best of delivering science, which should not be single way to a certain audience, and in very short form way that I know it appeals to young people, but really shouldn't. But so I have no idea how we should go around this. And if it's just what the market or the public demands, very snappy, smart thing, maybe we should adapt for it. But should we, or should we fight against it and try to do something differently? And if we can we do it with limited funding and all personal time we have, because not many people are willing to do it for free.
Great. Joshua.
No, I absolutely agree with that. That short form content is more a breeding ground for misinformation than anything else, oftentimes, and I have seen that so much often actively being used in that way, too. I think what is also important at this point is that we sometimes, like even in professional publications, a certain honesty about how speculative stuff is. I think being speculative in our writing or in our depictions would not be problematic at all if we would be more open about the process behind these depictions and how they came to be. And it's because it's so easy for an image to get cemented in pop culture, but also even within the paleo circles itself. Like sometimes I stumble upon images where I thought, oh yeah, that's how it should it's supposed to look like, but it's just one guy 20 years ago doing something a certain way, based on not much, and then everybody copied that, and only now it's revealed, oh, that was just bullshitting around, and we don't actually know certain details. And I think being more open about that, like, even when it comes to press release or stuff like that, maybe offering different interpretations of a fossil, I think can be really interesting and helpful with this process.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, Riley, come in.
Oh, I just wanted to say, Joshua, I've seen you do that to great effect on social media. So the plesiosaur piece recently, just going through the background of like how I made this piece, the science that goes into it. I tried to do something similar in Last Days of the Dinosaurs, and that like it is technically speculative paleontology. Like I was not there. I'm reconstructing these scenes as best we can tell, and the science is going to change. But there's an entire appendix where I try and lay out, this is what I'm bringing into it. This is what's speculative. This is what's science. And I think offering people both, it's similar to the way in which I've seen many museums do sort of modular displays, and that you can go and just look at the dinosaurs and walk away with something. You can then read the plaques, or you can look at the specimen numbers or see what parts of the skeleton are there. There's no magic bullet to make the public engage, and to make them know what we know and understand things the way and good, because it shouldn't be that way. There shouldn't be by dictate. But I think the more, rather than getting caught in despair, the more that we give basically people a hook, an image, something interesting, and then pull them through. Yes, there's going to be attrition on attention. It's going to be hard to find folks. AI and misinformation and meme accounts and photo scrapers and all these things are big problems. But we can't fight every front at the same time. And I think the more that we sort of enjoy the flexibility of this, talk about why are we making the choices that we are making, involving our thought process into the end product, not just presenting someone with something that's finished, saying this is the result of a process and this is how I did it, the more we will be able to make room, I think, for some of what we're trying to reach in this conversation.
There's a question I had that I suspect is actually very naive from the perspective of the historians who have actually thought about this at all, which is perhaps then useful for me to ask because it'll help me then learn stuff. So one of the things that really struck me during I think Alison's presentation was the connection between sort of wonder and childhood, and the way in which I've been teaching Helen de Cruz's book on Wonderstruck, which is just this big book about the nature of wonder and why it's important. And it was really striking in that ad and those other images, the ads for the museums, the way in which there was this idea that there was this thing that sort of children are allowed to do, which is, having wonder at things like dinosaurs, for instance. And when you are going into these spaces, you get to be a child again, where it's this idea that wonder is something that's for kids, really. And dinosaurs, therefore, also are for kids, because dinosaurs are objects of wonder, right? And that gives them this sort of kid codes them in this kind of weird sort of way, right? And I'd be kind of interested in hearing, I see Helen wants to come in on this. I see a brave raised hand. So Helen, if you'd like to come in, that would be wonderful. Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself.
I come in because I did a study quite a long time ago now. I got really fascinated by the way that kids are so enthusiastic about dinosaurs, but also they're amazingly informed. I mean, my connection to paleontology was I was Beverly Holsted's partner for many years, and so that got me into paleontology, which is an interesting route in itself. I'm actually a cultural psychologist. But we found what struck us in the study that we did was the kids of sort of from 3 to 6 years old, was the fact they are completely experts. Certainly 9-year-olds sound like undergraduates. So there's something about it. It's not only a question of wonder. There's something very, very special about the way that kids own dinosaurs once they get into it. I have no comparisons with astronomy or other fields, but it's fascinating that it's not just that the dinosaurs are for kids, but kids get into it. They learn these incredibly long words, much longer words than anything else in their vocabulary. They become experts extremely fast. We got them looking at asking why is this what kind of food does this animal eat? How do you know? And we gave them some pictures from other extinct creatures, which are really bizarre extinct creatures that don't exist now. I said, okay, what can you tell us about this creature? And they extrapolate from their knowledge of dinosaurs. These are 6-year-olds, very complicated taxonomic conclusions that they drew from. They were really experts, and that was a really fascinating thing, because there's not many areas really where what we might call even quite ordinary kids, not genius kids. These were not genius kids. They were ordinary kids, right, but ordinary. They were really, really into it. It's really fascinating. It's not only wonder, it's ownership. I think that's a key thing we found. It isn't just about it's wonderful. It's not the same kind of thing as Lord of the Rings, magic that is, and you're a New Zealander. But, I think that's holding that. And when you say that as adults, we cling on to our childhood in this area. Well, many of you are paleontologists. You've lived your life thinking of paleontology, but many people who dropped paleontology when they were about 7 or 8, as many of our people did actually, nevertheless, it was there. It was part of their development.
Helen, that was wonderful. I'm now finding myself thinking of all sort of wild explanations as to why it is that dinosaurs in particular seem to have such a wide-ranging kind of pull for detail, right? All I'm saying is that's a really cool question. Would someone else like to come in on this or anything else? We've had an advertisement for Helen's article, Dinosaur as Metaphor, which I have also read.
Right. Did you enjoy it, Adrian? Is the question.
Oh, I loved it. How could I not? Okay, so seeing as there's sort of a bit of a lull and we're getting towards the end, these online sessions can get a bit long. Perhaps it would be, behooving of us to sort of hand over to Chris to have sort of a final word, as is the editor's right. So Chris, would you like to just bring us home?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure if I have anything to sort of wrap things up with, but but thanks everyone for coming. This was all really, really interesting. And yeah, I think a lot of the quick discussions we were having in the sort of final bit around the role of childhood, about where the field can go next, and breaking down this category of the public, both in terms of what we're discussing, in terms of our more academic analysis, but also I think using these academic discussions we've been having more as a kind of springboard towards more public engagement side of things, and actually using the insights from the group towards more public facing kind of activities, something I'm kind of very keen on doing. That's something I'm quite interested in working on. And as sort of Natalia was insinuating, then one of the first things that you learn when you start doing any kind of public engagement work is that there is no such thing as the general public. Anything you do always needs to be directed towards a very particular group. And this is one where, you know, a field like paleontology does have a real sort of set of advantages, which again cause problems, because if you're doing paleontological outreach or using it, then you have such well-defined, such clear and such enthusiastic ready-made audiences, whether we're talking about, you know, the paleo fan community that was mentioned a lot in the chat, or children and the kind of very kind of committed children that Helen was talking about. Like, if you do any paleontological outreach, these are natural groups that will probably kind of be interested in almost anything that you do and focus on it, and therefore breaking out of these groups and reaching and working out ways to reach a greater diversity of people is a particularly difficult thing within this field. And so it's something which, you know, I'm quite interested in working on, quite interested in working about ways of thinking how we might do this, but obviously haven't had any answers to this yet. But this is definitely somewhere to kind of go next. And yeah, Mark says Paleontology Book 2, a Paleontology Public Book 2. Yep. And Richard Fallon actually on Blue Sky did suggest Paleontology in Private as a sequel volume, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for the great discussion. For those of you who are based in the UK, then we'll be having 2 sort of in-person things coming up in the nearest future. So if for people who are in London, they'll can make it to London, we'll be having an in-person launch on 22nd of March at King's, and also quite a lot of us will be at the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival on the 14th to 15th of June. So if anyone can make it to that, then to those, then please do. But otherwise, yeah, we'll be doing more stuff like this. We still have the kind of quite regular online sessions for the paleontology, popularizing paleontology group. So if anyone has stuck around to the end of this and wants to come to the sort of online meetings, and do just send me an email. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming.